It's an incredible honor for me to lead off the celebration today of the man who I believe to be the most important education reformer of the past half century, and I think a lot of people here would agree. I've written so many articles about Don Hirsch's work that a colleague recently suggested that my official title at Manhattan Institute should be changed to Senior Fellow for Hirsch Studies. But here's a little secret. I didn't become a Hirschian through a long and deliberative intellectual process. I actually turned to Hirsch's books for entirely personal and self-interested reasons. It was because of PS 87, also known as the William Tecumseh Sherman School, on the Upper West Side of Manhattan. It was the highly regarded New York City public school that my two sons attended from 1987 to 1997, which is just about the 10-year span between cultural literacy and the schools we need. My wife and I were incredibly happy when we learned that our oldest son was admitted to PS 87. It had just been named by Parents Magazine as one of the 10 best elementary schools in the United States, public or private. It also had a reputation as a, quote, progressive school. But I hadn't yet written a word about education. I was busy with the CIA and the Middle East and issues like that. So I didn't really know what progressive education would mean for my kids. I became an active PS 87 parent and soon found out everything I would want to know about progressive education. I learned that, first of all, that PS 87 had no common curriculum. Many of my son's teachers trained at Columbia University's Teachers College or the Bank Street College of Education, where they learned that they should teach the child, not the text, that all children are natural learners, that they can, who can construct their own knowledge, while the teacher became a guide on the side instead of a sage on the stage. So my son's third grade teacher decided on his own to devote months of classroom time to a project on Japanese culture, which included building a Japanese garden. Every day I would ask my son what he had learned in math that day. And every day he very happily said, "Dad, we're building the Japanese garden." My wife and I expressed our concern to the teacher about the lack of direct instruction of mathematical procedures, but he assured us that building the Japanese garden required real-life math skills, and anyway, he said, there was nothing to worry about. But I worried a lot. Even more so when my son moved up to fourth grade. His new teacher assigned even more real-life math problems, including one in which my son was asked to calculate how many Arawaks were killed by Christopher Columbus in 1492 during his conquest of Hispaniola. Meantime, PS 87's children were taught almost nothing about the American Revolution, the framing of the Constitution, the Civil War. I can still vividly recall a conversation with my younger son and several of his classmates when they were in fourth grade. I innocently asked what, if anything, they knew about the famous Union commander their school was named after. They gave me blank stares. After more inquiry, I realized that not only hadn't the children been taught about the man who delivered the final blow to the slaveholders' empire, but they knew almost nothing about the Civil War. When I informed PS 87's principal of my conversation with my son and his classmates, he told me also, "Don't worry. It's important," he said, "it's important to learn about the Civil War, but it's more important to learn how to learn about the Civil War." Of course, I continued to worry, and I also became desperate for some explanation of what was happening in my kids' classrooms, other than the self-serving rationalizations offered by the school's principal. I found it in Don Hirsch's first two books on education, Cultural Literacy and The Schools We Need and Why We Don't Have Them. Without ever having stepped into our schools, Hirsch was able to accurately describe PS 87's classroom culture. and he convinced me that my son's teachers had abandoned common sense in favor of progressive education fads supported by no evidence and that were causing more harm than good. Hirsch addressed my concern in virtually the opening sentence of Cultural Literacy. The unacceptable failure of our schools has occurred not because our teachers are inept, but chiefly because they are compelled to teach a fragmented curriculum based on faulty education theories. It wasn't that progressive educators favored the wrong curriculum, but that they stood for no curriculum at all. Citing romantic theories of child development going all the way back to Rousseau, they argue that with just a little assistance from teachers, children could figure it all out on their own. Thus, in our principal's immortal phrase, PS 87's children were learning how to learn. The most devastating consequence of this anti-curriculum doctrine was that it widened rather than reduced the gap in intellectual capital between middle-class children and those from disadvantaged families. Learning builds cumulatively on learning, Hirsch wrote, by encouraging an early education that is free of, quote, unnatural bookish knowledge and of inappropriate pressure to exert hard effort. Progressive education virtually ensures that children from well-educated homes who happen to be primed with academically relevant background knowledge, which they bring with them to school, will learn faster than disadvantaged children who do not bring such knowledge with them and do not receive it at school. Hirsch also wrote at that time that fighting for a content-rich curriculum was the, quote, new civil rights frontier. And this was long before politicians of both parties began using the civil rights analogy, no matter what education reform they happened to be for. This is a civil rights battle. Of course, the ed schools were not about to accept any outside interference from the university English department. The education professors turned on the interloper, branding him a reactionary, an elitist, and a defender of white privilege. In 1997, the Journal of the American Education Research Association published an unprecedented 8,000-word attack on Hirsch's work by an education professor named Walter Feinberg. That document is worth rereading today because it so perfectly illustrates what progressive educators believe about the purpose of American schooling and the curious language in which they express those beliefs. So let me quote Professor Feinberg enumerating all of Don's sins. He minimizes a history of racial and gender bias as factors in differential educational and economic achievement. That was one. Two, he dismisses complex theories of social class reproduction, and he demotes the importance of pedagogies that encourage the construction and negotiation of meaning across communities of difference. Three, he insists that teachers and the texts are the proper bearers and students the proper recipients of meaning. And finally, he refuses to understand the importance of meaning as a negotiated product in a multicultural society. Well, yes, one has to admit that Don was guilty as charged. And after reading Professor Feinberg's essay, I had a much better understanding of what my son's teachers at PS 87 were up to. Instead of teaching about the American founding, the Civil War, and long division, they were, quote, negotiating meaning across communities of difference. Hirsch ignored the postmodernist babble coming from the ed schools. He continued exposing the utter lack of scientific validity to the progressive's pedagogical principles. And most important, he remained the eternal optimist. He has always believed that in this democratic republic, good ideas eventually win out over bad ideas. And, quote, when I am feeling hopeful, I imagine to myself how things might change, Hirsch wrote back in 1989. A few schools scattered over the country will hold their pupils accountable for acquiring an agreed-upon minimum core of knowledge, grade by grade. Because classroom work in such schools will be more effective and interesting for their pupils, children will feel more curious and eager. Neighboring schools will observe the results and, not wishing to be outshone, will follow the lead. So Don famously began the Core Knowledge Foundation in his hometown of Charlottesville, which in turn created a grade-by-grade curriculum and a national network of core knowledge schools. Those 1,000 schools became the 1,000 points of light that he hoped eventually would spread the news to teachers and parents that a content-rich curriculum works better, particularly for disadvantaged children, than the fragmented curriculum favored by the ed schools. On this occasion, let's give a shout-out to those few who stood in solidarity with Don along the way. Hirsch received crucial early support from influential conservatives or centrists like William Bennett, Chester E. Finn, and Diane Ravitch, at least until she decided that the progressives were right after all. Another key supporter was Albert Shanker, president of the American Federation of Teachers. Shanker used his weekly columns in the New York Times to recommend the core knowledge approach to instruction. The AFT's quarterly magazine, American Educator, frequently published Hirsch's work. I think there are 2 editors in the room, so my appreciation to them as well. That meant that the million teachers who were members of the AFT at least had access to Hirsch's ideas about instruction that was denied to them in their education school courses. Another big breakthrough for core knowledge occurred in 2009 when New York City Schools Chancellor Joel Klein had the courage, extremely rare for a public official, to admit that he might have been wrong in choosing a progressive education literacy program for the city schools. Klein created a pilot program in which 10 elementary schools using core knowledge were matched with 10 demographically similar schools using the balanced literacy program from Teachers College. The study confirmed that students using core knowledge far outperformed those using balanced literacy. At about the same time, the Common Core state standards were published and eventually adopted by 46 states. Until the standards, there was little chance for Hirsch's supporters to convince school districts that the key to lifting academic achievement for all students was in a coherent, grade-by-grade curriculum. However, with the adoption of the Common Core, the states now committed, at least on paper, to complement the standards with a, quote, well-developed, content-rich curriculum. New York State chose the Core Knowledge Foundation to create the Common Core aligned reading curriculum for grades pre-K to 2. That curriculum is now posted on the State Education Department's website and available to every school in the state. Indeed, it's available to every school in the country because it can be downloaded for free. So after a quarter century of neglect by the education establishment, this is certainly a redemptive moment for Don Hirsch. Admittedly, it's way too early to declare victory in the battle for a coherent content knowledge curriculum in the schools. Common Core implementation is running into lots of hurdles in the states and school districts. In my view, many of these complications can be traced to the fact that the authors of Race to the Top foolishly tethered the Common Core to a faulty assessment regime and an even more problematic teacher accountability system based on student test scores. I am sure, I hope, that we'll be hearing about some of these problems in today's panels. Despite all that, it's a great consolation to me that PS 87's teachers are finally discussing the value of a grade-by-grade curriculum. And who knows, it might even include teaching about the Civil War. For that and for other breakthroughs to sanity in our kids' classrooms, let us now praise Don Hirsch for his 25-year struggle on the front lines of education reform. Thank you.